Imagine waking one morning to find out that 5 boys from your neighborhood had gone missing. Wouldn't that be devastating? This is exactly what happened to the residents from a South Korean village on the outskirts of Daegu City, when 5 boys mysteriously vanished on a national holiday. It was March 26, 1991. South Korea was having its first local election in over 30 years, and to celebrate the national event, the government declared it a temporary holiday, which meant that school was out. 5 young boys set out on what was going to be a fun-filled day of adventure. They had plans to catch salamander eggs in a nearby stream and ponds on Mount Waryong. But by the time the sun sets, little did U Cheol-won, Ho-yeon, Kim Jong-gyu, Park Shin-in, and Kim Jong-sik know that this would be the last day they would ever be seen alive again. The families of these 5 boys lived close together in a village on the outskirts of Daegu. Because the houses encircled each other, the children would spend most of their time together playing near the paddy fields that was in the front of the village. The boys saw each other as brothers. They had grown up together and so would always go out on adventures as a team. Because March 26 was a holiday, the boys woke up much later than usual. By around 8 or 9 a.m., these 6 kids from Seon-CU Elementary School were playing around Ho-yeon Ho's house, one of the residents of the village. 5 of them were the Frog Boys, and one of them was Tae-ron Kim. However, one of the tenants at Joe's house complained that the kids were being too noisy and loud and urged them to go somewhere else to play. But Tae-ron Kim was feeling hungry. He hadn't eaten breakfast, so he decided to go back home first and munch on something. And then he would meet up with his friends later on in the adventure. So the rest of the 5 boys headed up Mount Waryong with sticks and tin cans in their hands, and as loud as they could be. On their way, they met Ho-yeon's brother, Moo-yeon, who came across them while leisurely riding his bicycle around the village. He stopped to talk with them and told him that they were going out Mount Waryong to search for salamander eggs. Once Tae-yeon was done with his breakfast, he quickly hurried out of the house to catch up with his friends, but not before his mother strictly warned him not to go far from the village. He soon caught up with the other boys who were at the entrance of the Waryong hiking trail. But after hearing their plans of hiking higher up Mount Waryong to search for salamander eggs, Tae-yeon remembered his mother's stern warning not to go too far from the village. So he decided to go back home because he would rather miss out on salamander eggs than get yelled at by his mom. But little did he know that he had avoided the dark fate that the rest of the other boys would soon meet. Before their boys left, some of the parents can freshly recall the final moments they spent with their kids. Woo, father to Cheol-won, remembers the last conversation he had with his little boy. "My son came back to get a thicker jacket and headed for the door." Woo believes it was around 9 a.m. when his son had come back for the jacket. However, a little over 1 p.m., he was notified from the Taekwondo academy that his son attended that his boy had failed to attend his lesson. That's when it slowly began to sink in that his child could be missing. He started asking around the village whether anyone had seen his son. By 6 p.m., none of the boys had reported back to the house, and so Woo, together with the other parents, had become extremely worried. Something was definitely wrong. They began desperately searching all around Mount Waryong, but couldn't find a single trace of the boys. Feeling hopeless, the parents decided to contact the police around 7:50 p.m. When the local police arrived at the scene, they presumed that perhaps the kids might have wandered off into the mountain and gotten lost. So they searched through Mount Waryong until 3 a.m., but none of them were found. They went all the way up to the army base that was located on the western side of Mount Waryong. They even searched a pond that was on the right side of the mountain, right next to a range, but none of the boys showed up. By late afternoon the next day, it had dawned on Woo and the other parents that something terrible might have happened to their children. Had they been taken? Had they accidentally fallen into a hole and gotten trapped? Or worse yet, could they be dead? Once reporters found out from the police that the boys were missing, they quickly rushed to interview the distressed parents of the missing boys. At the time, Jahan Ju-hong Young was a novice journalist who had been assigned to follow the case. He recalls the first time hearing about the missing boys. At first, the local tabloids did not treat this case as worthy news. You see, they were so distracted with the ongoing local elections that the whole country's attention was fixed on who their new leaders were. After being told to wait for hours and hours for their children to return, Woo and the other parents became increasingly frustrated. Their emotions boiled over, and that's when things erupted. Woo recalls how the parents started accusing each other of why their kids were missing. They began pointing fingers haymakers at each other for being irresponsible parents. That's why their children were missing. Word soon spread around about the missing boys. In 5 to 6 days, national news broadcasters had made their way to the village reporting on the 5 boys who were mysteriously missing after going to catch salamander eggs. Soon, the whole of South Korea came to know the missing boys as the Frog Boys. After a week of reporting, people began questioning whether the kids were still alive. And if they were, the poor souls must have been terrified of being up on the mountain all on their own without their parents. Looking to gain national attention, the 5 parents scheduled for an interview with one of the country's most popular TV shows, The Square of Public Opinions, where they pleaded with the public to have a look at how carelessly the authorities were handling their case. For example, they didn't like the fact that the police had labeled their children as runaways. The parents felt that this was a way for the police to quickly wrap up investigations because, honestly, they just weren't interested in the case. The eye-opening broadcast, which was aired from the Seonseo Elementary School, became one of the most controversial and talked about episodes of the show. It also provided the parents with an opportunity to get the public to care more about their missing children and take action in search efforts. But a lot of crazy things happened during the show. For example, a young stranger called the show up claiming to be one of the boys. The call was immediately cut off by the telephone operator. Now, here's the strange thing. The person that had called was claiming to be Yeong-sik, crying and begging to come home. The whole audience screamed and cried in misery after the call. Perhaps the kids are still alive. We should make efforts to go out there and find them. Sadly, the parents' hopes of reuniting with their kids would soon be broken to pieces. Because as it turns out, the call they had received was nothing but a prank. Who would be cruel enough to do this to desperate parents? But their appearance on the show had a silver lining. Because once their interview was finished, the public came out in great numbers to help the parents in any way necessary. At the center of all the search efforts were the 5 fathers of the missing boys. They were determined to do all that was humanly possible to find the whereabouts of their precious children. The 5 men quit their jobs, rented a small lorry, and drove across the country looking for their precious babies. It didn't matter whether it was raining, sunny, or falling hailstones. They would do all it takes to ensure their boys were back home safe and sound. The lorry they had rented had photos of their children posted on both sides of the van. The large photos were further coated to prevent them from soaking in the rain and snow. Their children's angelic faces must be seen. And below these photos were the chilling words written in bold: "Please help find our missing children." The fathers looked tired. One of them seemed like he was on the edge of insanity. His face was pale and he could barely sit straight. It turns out that he had become addicted to sleeping pills to stay up all night searching for his son. It's the hope that was killing them. Here were 5 mentally strong men that were losing their health, wealth, and sanity, searching for their precious boys. The despair in their eyes was too much to bear. Some of them turned to alcohol just to cope with the pain. But in public, these fathers had to put on a brave face. They had to remain strong and hide their feelings for the sake of their sons. They had to meet up with journalists from all over the country while keeping their emotions intact, just in case their children were somewhere watching and wondering how they could get back home. Soon, their determination quickly caught the eye of the then South Korean president, Roh Tae-woo. Touched by their story, the president ordered the police to carry out the biggest missing person search in Korean history. He dispatched over 300,000 policemen, as well as several officials from the Special Investigation Center to look for the missing boys. The force searched every nook and cranny of the country, from bus terminals to irrigation waterways to reservoirs to alleys, and practically every train station in the country. But the government wasn't the only organization willing to help these parents look for their children. Other public companies, schools, and civic groups came together to donate more than 42 million won, about $35,000 at the time, as a reward for anyone who found the missing boys. Several flyers were also posted on every building across the country to help find the missing boys. Their faces were placed in newspapers, cartoons, candy wrappers, phone cards, billboards, milk cartons, with the name Frog Boys, a name that would later be the name of this bone-chilling case. Sadly for these desperate parents, most of the leads they got were either prank calls or people looking to cash in on the reward that they had placed for finding their children. Despite this, many people continued giving their support to the search efforts. The Korean media, for example, published several TV documentaries and movies on the missing children. These documentaries were watched by millions in an attempt to keep the case alive. But from all the 500 leads that the police got, none of them were genuine. The only tip that really caught the parents and the police's attention was from a man who claimed to be responsible for the crime. The man called and said that he had abducted the children and that they were living in horrible conditions. He even claimed that 2 of them were ill. He then demanded a large sum of money and mentioned a location where the exchange would take place. Finally, some hope that these parents would be reunited with their beautiful boys. But when the parents and the police arrived at the location, they waited for an hour, but no one showed up. They had no option but to return home, feeling miserable and helpless. The stranger never called again. Weeks turned into months, and months agonizingly turned into years. And sadly for the parents, they were in the exact same position they were in on the first day that their boys went missing. September 26, 2002. 2 men are hiking through Mount Waryong, searching for acorns, while appreciating the breathtaking views of the mountain. After a long day of collecting fruits, one of them noticed something totally horrifying in a shallow pit right in front of them. In this pit, there is a collection of small, human-like bones and tattered pieces of children's clothing. The 2 men had just discovered the crime scene of one of the most infamous missing child cases in the country. The bones discovered are those of the missing children, known as the Frog Boys. After finding this horrific pit, one of the men decides to call the police and immediately reports what they've found. A few hours later, the whole mountain is full of authorities and investigators searching for any evidence that might have been left behind. All 5 of the boys' bodies are found lying eerily in the pit, a mere 2 kilometers from where they were last seen, more than 11 years ago. It turns out that the location where the bodies were discovered had been completely ignored by search parties, despite the search teams carrying out several searches in the area. Whoever hid the bodies knew this mountain quite well. At first, the police found no evidence that the boys had been murdered. Instead, they claimed that the boys had died from hypothermia. One of the local newspapers even reported that the bodies of the boys had been found hugging each other, suggesting that they had tried to huddle close together to fight the biting cold. But many who had followed the case closely in the past decade weren't buying these results. How could these 5 children who had lived in this region all their lives find it hard to get back home? Yet they were only 2 kilometers from the village. Something about the police's statements was completely off. So the parents demanded that an independent autopsy be carried out on the bodies of the children. And once the autopsy was carried out, the results were shocking. It turns out that the boys had actually been murdered. A few of them had died from severe head injuries caused by blunt force trauma, while the others had bullet holes in their heads. Experts believe that the person or persons that had murdered these kids might have been professionals in carrying and operating arms. Another disturbing fact from the autopsy was that whoever murdered these boys did so with a lot of anger and aggression. Some of the boys had been battered repeatedly on the head with a blunt object, and one can only imagine how horrific their final moments were. As for the parents, they were completely heartbroken and devastated. Imagine waiting for so long with the hope that your child was still alive, only to discover that their final moments were a page right out of hell. These parents had sacrificed their lives, their money, and their time searching for their boys, and yet in their darkest hour, they were unable to defend their children from the cruelty of humanity. Some of the boys' mothers screamed in agony the first time they saw their children's withered bodies, especially after coming across the damaged parts of their skulls. Can you imagine seeing the bones of your child crushed like some sort of milk carton ran over by a car on the street? No words can describe this type of pain. After the location of the boys' bodies was discovered, a lot of questions arose about this case. First of all, how did this pit go undiscovered for more than 10 years? Because according to the moss that had gathered on the boys' skulls, it dated more than 10 years old. This proves that the bodies had not been moved for several years, and that the boys had died around the same time they left home in 1991. Another chilling fact about the boys' bodies is that their clothing had been tied together using strange knots. This made authorities question whether whoever murdered them must have worked in an industrial setting, or perhaps this was his or her calling card. We'll never know. But there is a strong possibility that this case might have just been solved if it wasn't for the incompetence of the authorities that handled the scene the first time they got there. According to reports, there was plenty of evidence discovered in the pit, but the police messed up the crime scene by plowing through the ground with pickaxes instead of using the proper forensic tools. It is also alleged that the bodies of the boys were recklessly transported from the scene using potato sacks instead of body bags. How crazy is that? For now, all we're left with is the question about what really happened that day. Was this a tragic accident or something premeditated? Was the pit the murder scene or just a dumping ground after the murder had been carried out somewhere else? Were there only one murderer or were there multiple murderers? Some people strongly believe that there had been at least two and took their lives. But according to expert analysis, both by Korean and American criminologists, it was most likely a single murderer, based on how consistent the aggression was dished out to each child. However, the question on every villager's mind on the slopes of Mount Waryong is, who in the world murdered these young, innocent boys? Several theories have come up over the years about the murder's origin, and some more believable than others. The locals, for example, think that the boys crossed paths with desperate lepers, who may have taken them because of a legend that a child's liver could cure leprosy. Others believe that the murders were a cover-up for a tragic military accident that took place because the boys wandered accidentally into the army's firing range and were gunned down. It could have been an elaborate cover-up because this firing range was only a few paces away from the shallow grave. While this sounds like the most reasonable theory, records show that there was no shooting practice on that day because it was a public holiday. Perhaps someone snuck onto the gun's range without being seen to blow off some steam? This might just be the case because during the early 90s, the mountain was found littered with bullet casings. And strangely enough, after the case of the missing boys went public, the military shifted their base to another town in 1994. The final theory brought forward was by Korean criminal psychologist Kim Jong-won. From his point of view, the murderer had to have been one of the father's boys. But this opinion greatly angered the public and was widely dismissed by authorities. He faced so much backlash for his insensitive comments that he was fired from his job and criticized by his fellow psychologists. To this day, no evidence has been brought forth linking any of the parents to the murder of their boys. In 2006, the statute of limitations was exceeded in this cold case, which meant that all crimes exceeding 15 years were discredited. So even if the prosecution did find evidence on the case would not be taken to trial. Thankfully for the parents seeking justice, this law was overturned in 2015, allowing any new evidence brought forth to be considered in the case. But sadly for the fathers and mothers whose children lost their lives, it's been a long wait for justice. Despite some of these parents being in their mid-60s and 70s, the pain is still as fresh as it was 30 years ago. Yes, there is something eerily terrifying about the murder of the Frog Boys, and it's not just about the murder itself, but the fear that every parent faces in life, losing their children. This goes to show that when your parents die, you bury them in the ground, but when your children die, you bury them in your heart. In closing, here's what one of the fathers told the unanimous criminal during a press interview. To the criminal, if you see this video, please allow our children to rest in peace before we die. With that being said, we've come to the end of this video. So who do you think actually murdered the Frog Boys? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. And if you'd like more blood-chilling stories delivered straight to your feed, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.